Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DIA. Thank you for joining us here at DIA Chelsea, for those of you here in the audience, and thank you to all of you tuning in virtually. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I'm DIA's Associate Curator, and I had the pleasure of working with Ian Wallace during his year-long Mellon Curatorial Fellowship here at DIA, of which the symposium today marks the culmination. Rethinking German Minimalism is our first hybrid event, yet on a topic foundational to DIA. DIA co-founder, the German art dealer Heiner Friedrich, wove relationships with Franz Erhard Walther and Imi Knoebel even prior to founding DIA in 1974. Portions of Walther's signature pieces, the first work set and the work drawings that are currently on view at DIA Beacon, were first presented at Friedrich's Munich gallery in 1967, while Imi Knoebel not only exhibited consistently with Friedrich first and DIA after since 1971, but also assisted with logistics of DIA's presentations in Germany. And I can't help thinking that the questions of art storage and logistics that are so prominent in his work have something to do with these collaborations. Similarly, infrastructural in nature and reconfigurable is the endlessly stimulating work of Charlotte Posenenske, which entered DIA's program more recently and is now on view at DIA Beacon alongside their peers. And I encourage you all to go see these three shows and visit Beacon. DIA time is generous. The exhibitions will remain on view for at least another year, but don't miss them. So I'm very grateful to our panelists today, Gordon Hall, Hannah Holding, Colin Lang, Gregor Kwak, Michael Sanchez, and Song Tu, and I look very much forward to hearing your perspectives on these practices today. So before passing it on to Ian, I wish to thank my colleagues at DIA, Kathleen Anderson, Theodora Lang, Max Tanon, and Dan Wolf, for making this event possible. And now, please join me in welcoming Ian, Gordon, Hannah, Colin, Gregor, Michael, and Sung.
Thank you, Mathilde. Yeah, and as Mathilde mentioned, this is a hybrid event. So Michael and Gordon are here in person. Everyone else is in the cloud on Zoom, in our presence immaterially. Yeah, and thank you all for coming out in the rain, and also to everybody who's watching via Zoom. And I want to welcome you to today's event, Rethinking German Minimalism. So, as Mathilde kind of mentioned, this symposium was organized on the occasion of DIA Beacon's simultaneous presentation of three artists who were each working in West Germany in the 1960s, and who have been associated with the somewhat ill-defined category of German minimalism, those being Imi Knoebel, Charlotte Posenenske, and Franz Erhard Walther. So our purpose today is to both invite alternative historicizations of these three artists' practices, as well as to explore their relevance, both the avenues they might open up and the problems they present to artistic and institutional practice today. For those of you who have not yet had the chance to see the exhibitions at Beacon, and I strongly recommend that you do if you're able, on view are three bodies of work that at first glance appear morphologically or stylistically comparable to contemporaneous US practices. All three of these artists, however, produced work that involves a level of participation or activation by the viewer that is distinct from sculptures being produced in the US at the same time. There's some overlap, but this is kind of a different situation. And I would argue that these three artists' work also reflects tacit anxiety about the work of art's commodity status, specifically within an increasingly international and financialized art market in West Germany in the 60s. So in the mid-1960s, Germany was in the midst of a seemingly miraculous economic recovery, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, after the sanctions of the war. Meanwhile, at the same time, the nation hosted the world's first art fair, the Kunstmarkt in Cologne. An image of the opening is on the left, in 1964. And an influx of contemporary American art into European markets set up a clash between old world and new world ideas of art's patronage and meaning. At the same time, a boom in the market for inexpensive and reproducible artist multiples created tension between the drive to democratize art, which was a big interest of artists at the time, and critiques of art's increasingly evident commodification. So just some, a few images to kind of get the flavor here. But on the right, these are images from Documenta in 1968, where there's this huge contingent of American artists represented, and that kind of causes an outcry among younger German artists who feel they're being sort of pushed to the side. I think these tensions are perhaps most clear in the work of Charlotte Posenenske, who in 1967 devised a modular sculptural system, her Vierkantrohre, or square tubes, which are fabricated in unlimited series and sold at the cost of production. There's an aluminum version and a cardboard version. Though they're intended to be infinitely reconfigurable and displayed in non-art contexts, ideally, recent exhibitions have implicitly placed Posenenske's work in dialogue with US art from around the same time. So what I'm showing here is an image from a 2015 exhibition at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, where, as you can see, these reconfigurable Posenenske sculptures were installed to basically more or less look like Donald Judd sculptures, this kind of serial repetition of the same form. Franz Erhard Walther's Werksatz, or first work set, 1963 to 69, similarly invites or requires interaction by the viewer. His fabric sculptures, which are normally displayed in a storage form, as he calls it, are activated by a performing body or bodies, in this case, by lying inside of the fabric sculpture on the floor. Also on view in Beacon is Imi Knoebel's 250,000 Zeichnungen, or 250,000 drawings, which is a work consisting, as the title suggests, of 250,000 graphite drawings that are stored and displayed inside 6 austere, custom-built cabinets. So that's what you're looking at here. And these are shown at Beacon in the current exhibition alongside examples of his Minigebilder and Minigeskulptur, so his red lead paintings and sculptures. And there's some debate around this point, but it seems that Knoebel originally intended for viewers to actually open the cabinets and manually go through the drawings. But this is something that's never been realized in an exhibition context, and in the current show, they're closed and locked. While there are certainly stylistic and sometimes social connections between these artists and their US contemporaries, critical discussion of minimalism in Germany was surprisingly limited at the time, with the developments of the 1960s primarily understood via reference to pop and conceptual art. So for example, the catalog to the 1976 exhibition, American Art from 1945 to Today, which was at the National Gallery in Berlin, this is one of the few thorough surveys of the German reception of American art in the post-war period. It includes sections dedicated to action painting, color field and hard edge painting, pop art, conceptual art, and artist prints. But the term minimalism is entirely absent, as is any reference to Robert Morris's seminal series of essays, Notes on Sculpture, which is kind of the go-to text for thinking about American minimalism, and had been published a full decade earlier in Art Forum. This is also despite the fact that a few years earlier, the March 1968 exhibition Minimal Art at the Haag's Gemeentemuseum in the Netherlands had united US and European artists under the title of minimalism for the first time anywhere, effectively codifying minimalism as a style and as a significant international movement. In Germany, the concept of seriality and all its variations provided an alternative to the largely abstract discourse of phenomenology that preoccupied artists like Morris, particularly with the 1967 exhibition Serielle Formationen, or Serial Formations, which was organized by the gallerist Paul Maines and the artist Peter Rohr, who were both friends of Posenenske's in Frankfurt. And that show proposed that artists working with serialized forms had internalized aspects of industrial production. So much of the writing you see by artists, by critics at the time is engaged with this idea of seriality rather than minimalism per se. So our aim today is to rethink Knoebel, Posenenske, and Walther's practices with a mind to the specificity of this historical context, as well as to draw out some of the themes, contradictions, and problems, perhaps, that their work presents for institutions like DIA that seek to present their work today. So, Gregor Quack and Hannah B. Hulling will be speaking about Franz Erhard Walther's work. Gregor is an art critic, curator, and PhD candidate at Yale University. His dissertation in progress focuses on Walther's fabric objects, inviting us to trace their genesis backwards to the social context of the 1950s, rather than focusing on the 60s. Hannah will then take us into the present. Hannah B. Hulling is Associate Professor of the History of Art at University College London and Research Professor at Bern University of the Arts in Switzerland. Her research, publications, and teaching focus mainly on the philosophy and theory of conservation and art and material culture since the 1960s. So she'll discuss the issues raised by the institutional life, you could say, and conservation of Walther's work. Speaking on Imi Knoebel will be Gordon Hall and Colin Lang. Gordon Hall is an artist based in New York. Hall has exhibited and performed at, among others, Art in General, the Brooklyn Museum, Movement Research, Socrates Sculpture Park, the Drawing Center, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Gordon has previously published a fantastic essay on Walther, but today we'll be engaging with Knoebel's 250,000 drawings and speaking on the theme of the closed box. Colin Lang is an art historian, critic, and editor living in Berlin. He received his PhD in art history from Yale University in 2010. And Colin will provide a historicization of Knoebel's work that reflects the influence of Joseph Beuys, in part, and takes us deeper into the artistic context of Düsseldorf in the 1960s. So then, time allowing, we're going to have a short break, about 10 minutes. And after that, we'll have Michael Sanchez and Song Tiu, who are both going to speak about Posenenske. Michael Sanchez is an art historian living in New York. He received his PhD in art history from Columbia University in 2016. And Michael will be presenting on Posenenske's two-person exhibition with Hannah Darbovin at Conrad Fisher Gallery in the winter of 1967, with a mind to the specific social context in which her reconfigurable square tubes were first conceived. And finally, Song Tiu is an artist based in Berlin. Her work has been exhibited at international venues, including Haus der Kunst in Munich, Nottingham Contemporary, and Galerie für Zeitgenössische Kunst in Leipzig. And it's currently on view at Kunstmuseum Bonn. Sung has researched and written on minimalism as a mode of cultural propaganda, or cultural imperialism, and will provide a broader view of the style's political stakes on the international stage. So after the presentations, there will be a Q&A. And for those of you who are watching on Zoom, please feel free to write your questions directly into the Q&A function. We have somebody who's monitoring that, and then we'll pull them out at the end. Without further ado, I'll invite Gregor to take the stage, so to speak.
For the introduction, Ian, I'm zooming in from Berlin. And I want to thank Dia, I want to thank Ian and Matilda especially for giving me the opportunity to be here. So unlike the other academics taking part in this panel today, I do not yet have my PhD, and I'm currently right in the middle of writing it, with all the uncertainties and occasional mental chaos that process can induce. And because of this, I have decided not to simply read something from my painfully in progress dissertation, and rather to articulate a few thoughts sparked by the theme of today's symposium and by the three artists, Knoebel, Posenenske, and Walther, and especially Walther, whose work is now on display at DIA. And then I hope, as you'll know, because I only have a few minutes, the thoughts will be half-baked, but I hope we can further bake them together in the conversation after. All right. First, I confess that to rethink German minimalism never occurred to me before today's conference. It's true that Franz Erhard Walther's work featured prominently in the 2012 exhibition on German minimalism at Daimler in Berlin. And also the gallerist and art historian Alexander Koch has usefully described Franz Erhard Walther's work as participatory minimalism. In both cases, however, my suspicion is that what these terms describe is less a real historical relationship based on similar artistic strategies and concerns, and more a case of what you might call convergent evolution, the arrival at similar forms that arise from rather distinct historical and material circumstances. In fact, at least in Walther's case, and that's the artist of the three I know the best, even that type of pseudomorphism, pseudo-isomorphism only goes so far. For every sculpture evoking, at least in the black and white still photograph, the formal straightforwardness of American minimalist sculpture, there's another piece from the same period that would evoke a wholly different set of visual references. So the minimalist, the maybe minimalist Nesselplatten on the left are being made at the same time as the Luftkissen made from magazine advertisements in 1963. Even within Walther's central group of works, the first work set, which is now on view at DIA in its storage form, every possibly minimalist form on the left is met with another piece in which the same or a similar form, in here sort of the cross, is supplemented with sundry materials like a handsaw, like a plastic bag, and a spray can of artificial pine scent, which perhaps doesn't seem particularly in line with sort of Morris's notes on sculpture. So, oh yeah, and here's a diagram of convergent evolution. So rather than asking what these three artists have in common with their US American counterparts, I was wondering, what could I say that these three artists have in common with one another? And how do these commonalities matter today? When I look at many of the work by Franz Erhard Walther and Posenenske, and even some by Knoebel, though Colin might have to correct me there, the one uniting factor that to me really jumps out is the way in which all of these artists produce work that evoke or even resemble things like HVAC systems, bus stops and revolving doors, self-storage units, all things we now would commonly think of as types and forms of infrastructure. Looking at much of the work by the three artists united here, the focus on various forms of infrastructure seems a pretty common theme throughout their careers. So rather than maybe German minimalism, we could, with many grains of salt, call them works of infrastructuralism. So what is infrastructure and what do I mean by it? Obviously, the term infrastructure derives from Latin infera, which means below, and so it's the structure below something. And I think it originally comes from the 19th century, but in the 50s, which is the period that I'm most interested in right now, its most prominent use would have been something like the NATO common infrastructure, a term that describes, quote, the buildings or installations essential to the combined training or operational deployment of NATO forces. And in this case, as you'll see later, for me, this military pedigree of the term is not purely accidental. However, in the 1960s and 70s, the term infrastructure is also picked up increasingly by urban planners and architects, and it receives a gradual shift in meaning that arrives at something, at the meaning of the term that is now most prominent perhaps among anthropologists who study infrastructure. And I found this definition, which I find very useful, which is by Brian Larkin, quote, infrastructures are matter that enable the movement of other matter. Their peculiar ontology lies in the fact that they are things and also the relation between things. As things, they are present to the senses, yet they are also displaced in the focus on the matter they move around. And I think this is pretty interesting when we think about these artists for two reasons. On the one hand, this allows us to think about all three artists in terms of how they relate to their political and social surroundings, to the sort of social infrastructures around them. All three, I think, to different degrees and in very different ways, bring infrastructure from the periphery of focus to the center of focus. To put it in terms of sculpture, whereas one of the most persistent and recognizable formal features of US minimalist sculpture was the lack of a support structure, the lack of a plinth, many of the objects Walther has produced are all plinth. They, and so three examples here, they inhabit and specify the twofold ontology of infrastructure to the status of the artwork. They float somewhere between being themselves a work and being the support for an artwork perpetually waiting to happen. All this is interesting to me, not chiefly because it helps refine and reorder a linear history of artistic progress, but because I think it can sort of occasion a refinement of thinking about infrastructure that is useful both for looking at art history and larger scale political considerations of the time and even of the present, perhaps. If all three of the artists we're discussing today are in one way or another concerned with infrastructural matters, then we quickly notice that while all infrastructure addresses the movement of matter, they deal with first deal with very different types of matter, and perhaps more importantly, they influence the movement of matter in very different ways. So that would, in economics, a traditional categorization of different infrastructures is that between hard and soft infrastructure. And I think everybody that has tangentially followed the recent US political cycle does not need me to remind them of the inadequacy of that distinction between hard and soft infrastructure. And so we'll have to maybe come up with a new subcategorization. I would propose that the work of the three artists in question here, and especially that of Walther, could help us sort of perform a kind of new Grundlagenforschung, a new basic research on the different kinds of infrastructure that exist. And here are my very preliminary suggestions. We could say, first, there's an infrastructure of connection that conducts and directs movement. There's an infrastructure of storage, which arrests and stabilizes movement. And there is an infrastructure of separation and distinction, which regulates and limits movement. And maybe, I mean, these are ideas, and maybe we can discuss some of these movements and types of movement later on. So why is all that interesting to my current work on Walther? And the reason is that I'm currently at work on a section of my dissertation that discusses Walther's early years in Fulda, in the provincial town of Fulda. And one of the features of Fulda is that it's located in the Rhön, in sort of a sort of middle mountainscape right in the center of Germany. And as you can see here, this is a contemporary photo. This was the area right close to the innerdeutsche Grenze, what would later become the inner German border between West and East Germany, which, and specifically, Fulda's location on the so-called Fulda Gap meant that it was the area of Germany, or one of the areas in Germany with the heaviest US military presence. And so here, I think, because of the proximity of this demarcation line, there's two ways in which lines of division and separation are very important to Walther's early work. On the one hand, the sheer activity of being sort of an avant-garde artist in a very conservative small town brought a need to distinguish oneself from local sentiment and from a parent's generation that remained associated with the crimes of the recent German past. On the other hand, there is the division between that is between sort of a US-influenced West Germany and a nascent sort of East Germany. So for both the country and young Walther, the mechanisms of large and small scale social life were not a given, but had to be reinvented and tested after World War II. And I think that forms of distinction were central to that. Where as much of 1960s aesthetics and art practice are concerned with blurring different lines, Walther remained concerned with finding connection while maintaining distinction. And this, I think, is very important for Walther's work, which starts in the 50s, and later work that starts in the 60s. So all this becomes noticeable in some of Walther's first mature works. In this case, these are the Rahmenzeichnungen, or the frame drawings from 1959. These drawings, I think, are all, as you can see, they're all distinction. They're all inside and outside, but they make that line dynamic and translucent. In Walther's first exhibition that garnered sort of acclaim in his, or outrage in his small town in Fulda, Neue Impulse Fulda in '63, Walther presented a series of different works, especially the paper pillows that he had feverishly produced in the years before. But the work that drew the most attention from visitors to the show is the line that you see on this floor. The other artists involved in the show and visitors were outraged by the suggestion of this line that Walther's work would be separated from everything else in the show. And I think that sort of speaks to attention and sort of a sense of anxiety about processes of division at the time. And I think this early preoccupation with boundaries also carries over into the work set, which is the series of work that is now on display at DIA. A work like the number 42 in the work set called Vier Körpergewichte, or 4 body weights, was originally called Vierer Verbindung, or 4-point connection. But then Walther changed the name to 4 body weights. And I think you can sort of see why the shift away only from connection happens if you look at the photo on the right, which shows the same piece on display at Documenta 5, where you can see that the work is as much a connection between the different participants in it as it is a separation between participants and outside spectators. Here is another piece from the work set, number 31, für zwei, which is on one hand sort of an provocation and a sort of motivation for a conversation between two people, but on the right you see a drawing that is associated with this piece, and as you can read, it calls for this dialogue to be formalized, which I think is the idea here being that if dialogue is left unchecked, recent German past and the German presence in the 1950s showed where unchecked and unconsidered conversation could lead. And this, I think, is to me the point why at this point infrastructures of segmentation are important to Walther, and because segmentation is both a tool for the exertion of power, but also can be a form of resistance against different kinds of authoritarianism. So here on the left is Sockel 4 Bereiche, plinth 4 sections, which is number 49 in the work set. And on the right, there is a drawing that is associated with this piece. And at the bottom, it says Teile aber herrsche nicht, which I have loosely translated as divide, but do not conquer. It's very loosely translated. And I think this to me is sort of the crux of sort of infrastructural processes of division in Walther's work at the time, that you see between sort of his parents' generation, between the conservatism of the local town of Fulda, between US individualism, and between sort of socialist realism right across the border in East Germany. The idea is that you have to find a form of connecting that is not at risk of spilling over into sort of mindless sorts of consumerism or conformism or mindless communalism. And instead, you have to both connect, but also divide without ever putting anyone in the position of absolute authority. And so with that, I'm looking forward to the next talk and especially to our conversation in a few minutes. Thank you.
Great. Let me just share my screen. Thank you so much, Jan and Matilda and all colleagues at DIA. I am so very pleased to be here. Thank you, Gregor, for giving us so much food for thought. I am greeting everyone from my home in Zurich, which I share with a 1-year-old, so you might happen to hear some soundscape in the background. My contribution, which I will just read to speed things up, is based on the experience of several of my encounters with Walther's work as a participant and a museum professional, a different kind of actualization, if you wish, or use or way of practicing them as social technological constructs. The starting point for my fascination with Walther's work was during a lecture Walther held at the Ruhr University Bochum, and later on many occasions, but most importantly perhaps at the ZKM, Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, Germany, where I cared for his works in my former life as a conservator. And here, my investigation of his work starts from a situation encountered in Van Abbe Museum, Eindhoven. I contemplate the folded fabric adorned with Walther's drawings accompanied by photographs to think, among others, how these objects require different types of reading or decoding, how they, of course, script bodily movements, but also how they might, alongside the photographic and handmade notations, serve as three-dimensional scores and kits to fulfill the idea of something of an open work, perhaps, if we follow Umberto Eco, in which the work is not predetermined, but rather passed on to interpreter in form of a construction kit. On these shelves, and you will see here another Werksatz photographed in views. On these shelves, the components of the artwork seem to rest, still and silent, ready to use, but the full work has not arrived yet. But let me rewind a bit and get into the aspect that seems crucial, not only for me, but also for Walther, namely that of the conception of his kits, and also something that really conservation or musealization of those work really thinks about. In my larger project, which is not a doctoral dissertation, and it's really, just a little rendezvous, I would say, with Walther's work, I ask, when does this work come into being, and when might we say the work is, right? How do we determine what the work is, and who gets to decide the angle from which it is analyzed? And these are actually all questions that are connected with conservation and institutionalization of the species, and perhaps we can come back to it in the discussion if this is less clear. Walther conceived of his fabric objects, Werkstücke, as a starting point for actions performed by a viewer participant. But the definition of what his works are remains fluid, not exclusively objects and not entirely performance, a notion Walther actually has dismissed by saying, I never did performances. His works elude any stable definition. Over the years, Walther has referred to these works as instruments or implements or sculptures, implying not only distinct formal concepts, but also ontologies. As instruments, his fabric objects appear to act as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. As autonomous sculptures, they are never inactive. Crucially, Walther conceives of his works also as being completed in the mind of the viewer, a trope that connects them to the preconceptual legacy of Fluxus. In my essay exhausting conservation, object even performance in Franz Erhard Walther's Werkstücke, I expose at length how his works exist as assemblages of activated works, events, and active physical artifacts, starting points and remnants or relics of activation. His works shift between ontological categories and material formations. The short durational or ephemeral character of Walther's activation troubles the traditional collecting and care that relies on the enduring physicality of art. The objectual element upsets the notion that this art can and should be used, thereby generating exhibition copies that confound the idea of an authentic original. Walther often refers to his early rejection of the traditional fine arts categories. He distinguishes between sculpture and plastic, which he uses in the sense of plastic art, and treats plastic not as a finished product, but as a process. He's also interested in Handlung, a German noun indicating an action or deed. When one acts, handelt, a Handlungsstück, an act piece, is created. Handlung incorporates hand, the German word for hand, right? Endowing action with an authorial, even if not necessarily manual dimension. The hand can but does not need to be the artist's. Notably, Walther's work has been fabricated by the artist's former wife, Joanna Walther, and obviously also others, but mainly by her. Viewing Walther's works as Handlungen places them within the time they are enacted and emphasizes their short-lived character. According to the artist, these works are neither representational, nor do they tell a story. Rather, their meaning develops in action. Very quickly. Does it work? Not really. Okay. Handlung, action, can take place both through the physical acts that a participant performs and through his or her imagination. Handlung, action, is thus a form of imagination in which one projects an action just as much as it is a physical corporeal act in which the body becomes a part of the work. Imagination and projection as a form of realization of an artwork have a practical aspect. They can be employed, for instance, during a realization of a work, of an artwork. They can be employed, for instance, during an exhibition, a biennial, or a display, when the handling of a work set by audiences might result in damage. Because the work can occur both in projection and in action, they are interchangeable. Walther proposes one more distinction for his art. You know it already, the Lager form, storage form, and Handlungsform, action form. Although a work that rests dormant enters a storage form, it is not to be conceived as an incomplete work. According to the artist, a work's inactive form is but a different state of the same work. And it's actually really interesting also to notice here that early in his career, Walther was less concerned with the activation of the viewer than with actions performed with an object. Okay, there is a short and long duration in Walther's work. Handlung is performed for a short time, one could say. Once concluded, the performative aspect of the work appears to abate. The work seems to be partially contained in an object and yet partially unavailable when it's completed or discontinued. Unlike a continuous object, activations occur intermittently. Walther claims that when he has completed an artwork, when he takes up a position in a piece, he cannot see it. And when he sees it, he cannot complete it. Therefore, the observation and the real Handlung or activation are always divided. One of them always has to be imagined. Speaking of his wall formation, Walther says, when you look at it, you address it as sculptural painting or a pictorial sculpture. And it is a fragment because there is a spot where you should incorporate your body. But when you step into it, what is it then? You complete the work with your body. Yet it's still a fragment because you can't see it anymore. It becomes a matter of imagination. On the one hand, a temporary circumscribed moment is deepened during the artwork's engagement and activation, after which the work recedes into the memory and imagination. On the other hand, the artwork is a physical object with its openness and availability for Handlung. This dynamic form, the interchangeable existence of the work as Handlung and Handlung as the work, has allowed Walther's art to persist. Handlungsform and Lagerform, however, coexist as ontologically diverse constructs, the kinetic event and the self-contained objects, each implying the other. Sites of performative and material struggle, Walther's works are alternately object and action, the way Joseph Jastrow's duck rabbit drawing shifts between the two animals. We can only experience and perceive them as one or the other, never simultaneously. Preserved as objects, Walther's pieces discourage use and the accompanying wear and tear. Preserved as acts, they invite activation and ultimately destruction. But is the logic of the back and forth between the active object and the activation event sufficient to conceive of those works in their long material durée? Because Walther's works demands activation or use by a viewer, copies or replicas of pieces that once were considered unique have been fabricated for handling, as Walther's works have been withdrawn from use and placed in collections. It was interesting in one of the interviews with one of the MoMA curators, they speak, for instance, of them as ghosty artifacts, the exhibition copies as sort of ghosty artifacts. But what does it mean when a Werkstück begins its existence as a double, one that might develop its own parallel history and memory? To introduce a copy complicates the presence of the original. Reiteration or repetition ceases to be the exclusive domain of the Handlung. Replicas make it possible to reenact the making and thus to reinstantiate the physical object. Replicating a Werkstück requires a knowing hand, material intelligence and craftsmanship, and the ability to read the instruction. Whether in terms of the physical object or its activation, remaking mediates the creative, generative process involved in the work and its world, including the social networks entailed in its fabrication and the conditions within the work can be accomplished. According to the anthropologist Tim Ingold, in Western thought, form, and I'm quoting here, form came to be seen as imposed by an agent with a particular design in mind, while matter, thus rendered passive and inert, became that which was imposed upon. Making, however, is more analogous, he says, to sewing, and it's an interesting analogy actually to Walther here, to sewing or weaving than to shooting arrows at a target. Rather than a linear progression from a single point of creation, an artwork's trajectory can be seen as a meshwork, right, with countless open nodes and loose ends. In such a meshwork of interconnections, both physical objects and activations can be regarded as points of arrival and departure. And in this larger piece, I actually think of them as assemblages and systems, as systems also, institutional systems. But perhaps we can take it up in our conversation afterwards. And I'm going to just show very quickly Franz Erhard Walther. This is a very nice photograph of the artist. And thank you so much for your attention. And this is the book that will be coming out very shortly from Barthes, where this essay, which parts I was just presenting, is also published, will be also published, and amongst many brilliant contributions to the book by brilliant colleagues. So thank you so much.
On closed boxes. From across the room, they look like 6 black rectangular monoliths lined up evenly along the wall. As I move closer, 3 silver metal inlays along the form's vertical corners reveal themselves to be hinges, and the faces become a pair of closed panel doors, 2 sets of silver keyholes found at my knee and head height. These boxes are in fact cabinets. The exhibition text tells me that the title of this work by Imi Knoebel, 250,000 drawings, describes the contents of the cabinets, 912 boxes holding 250,000 graphite drawings of juxtapositions of 2 straight lines on letter-sized paper produced by Knoebel between 1968 and 1975, for which these painted wood cabinets were specifically designed and made. I further learned that during the first and only other time this work was exhibited at DIA in 1987, visitors to the museum could ask to have the cabinet doors unlocked by the gallery attendant and to be shown the drawings, although, according to that exhibition's curator, Katharina Schmidt, no one ever asked. This time, there does not seem to be an invitation to request to be shown the contents of Knoebel's cabinets. This furniture sculpture poses several practical yet unanswered questions. Are there boxes of paper inside the cabinets? Are these papers actually each a unique drawing? Are the cabinets really locked? Do the doors even actually open? Ian asked me if I would like him to find out the answers, and I refused, realizing that I did not want to know anything beyond what is already publicly accessible information. Not out of laziness or shyness or time constraints, but because the more I thought about what this sculpture offers, the less I wanted to know the truth of what is inside Knoebel's storage cabinets. I love it when objects ask me to believe them. I'm reminded of reliquaries, the ornate boxes that hold the invisible or unverifiable pieces of bone, fabric, or hair of saints, precious because of what they claim to contain, but also precious because the box itself requests our belief. To trust in the reliquary's credibility is not only to state this belief, but to put it into practice. Belief, in this formulation, is no longer only an intellectual process, but an aspect of perception itself. I see the box differently when I believe it contains an invaluable relic. In some sense, all objects ask for a version of this belief, particularly three-dimensional ones, as I conjure the sides of the thing I cannot see as I move around it, faithfully piecing all the time-elapsed views together into one object, one thing whose back I can only believe in. Thank you, Husserl. I believe that this chair has legs under it, holding it up. Just as we spatially and temporally intend the unified object by piecing it together through time, we also intend it through the knowledge of it as a category of a thing. I see a chair as separate from a table, as separate from the floor, because I know, I have been taught, that what these things are. In this way, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the objective world is only there because I believe in it. I can't readily verify whether Imi Knoebel's 6 cabinets contain 250,000 drawings, which, if you're wondering, averages out to approximately 98 drawings a day for 7 years. And though I am curious, I also don't want to know the truth, because I believe they are in there, and when I look at the cabinets, I see them as full. This exercise of vision as a form of belief is far more valuable to me than empirical fact in this case, because, I presume, it flexes a capacity that is so vital to trans and gender nonconforming life. Not just believing what people say about what is inside them, but also allowing, even encouraging, that knowledge to shape our vision, our read of a body. A full cabinet looks different than an empty one, depending on what one believes, even while on another register, it looks exactly the same. It's a troubling idea, seen through the haze of our present moment's zest for misinformation and the political and social harm caused by collective dedication to untruths. But I must defend our capacity for our perception to be shaped by our belief, Because for me, and so many people like me, we know what we are looking at, even when others refuse to believe it's real. When reading bodies, perception is belief. This kind of shared perceptual belief shapes communities, which create boundaries that then must be guarded and maintained. On a large scale, these kinds of boundaries work against accessibility and inclusivity, creating public institutions that are not meaningfully available to broad publics. When it comes to powerful and historically elitist institutions, openness is long overdue. But, and this is a but that I care deeply about, there are some spaces that need boundaries. Boundaries that exclude, but also protect. These kinds of spaces, community spaces, marginalized spaces, need to remain mostly closed, because communities are destroyed by the presence of too many people who can't see because they don't believe. This is what subculture means, and why safe spaces feel, if not safe, at least tolerable, livable. Shared mutually reinforcing vision puts belief into practice, allowing one to extend oneself into space, as Sarah Ahmed has described it. I think many people have that feeling most of the time, the frictionlessness of one's body falling into line. For others, the rare contexts in which this feeling is possible must be fiercely defended, even at the risk of being unwelcoming. The box has got to stay closed. Imi Knoebel is himself a sort of a closed box, refusing to say much of anything about his work, just a small handful of interviews over his more than 60-year career. It's fitting, this reticence, because it mirrors the kind of refusal performed by 250,000 drawings. Not only are they monochrome black boxes, but they are also, presumably, locked shut. They read as a row of no's. No, 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 no. Full of answers, maybe, but not ones that will be readily given. I've thought for years about formally reduced sculpture's capacity to offer a resource for those of us looking to refuse. Refuse what? Legibility, respectability, cliched symbolism, representation, gatekeeping, surveillance, self-explanation, medicalization, gender-affirming surgery letters, gay marriage. The need to make ourselves coherent according to presently existing logics, even when those logics do not fully enable our lives. Formally reduced abstraction has often felt like a way through, to answer the questions not asked, to refuse the demand for legibility, while still claiming a voice, asking to be looked at, and then turning away. Seeking out your gaze and then asking something different of that gaze in return. I visit Imi Knoebel's work at Dia Beacon Raum 19 multiple times a year, and it continues to give more to me as an artist than probably any other artwork I've seen. Its smooth and uniform masonite surfaces, its unsymbolic shapes, the way it so generously turns itself inward, gives itself to me as a language. Raum 19 is also defined by its capacity for change, its rearrangeability. The 77 objects in this collection have no fixed positions, and no arrangement of this piece is ever definitive or final, producing a sense of always extending possibility, what Giorgio Agamben might describe as potentiality. 250,000 drawings shares this, insofar as alongside its other characteristics, serial, uniform, closed, black, locked, is this one, openable. Just as the closed box can function as a request for belief, a resource for subcultural community, or a model for political refusal, it also always offers the possibility of change. A closed box might open. The embodied potential of these Imi Knoebel sculptures feels like a gift. Things are the way they are now, but there is always reason to think that they could be different. A future that feels foreclosed leaves me in need of another world, but unable to believe in one. This row of closed and locked cabinets offers itself to me as a horizon, tinged with the sense that there are other possibilities, even if I don't know what they are. This pointing is invaluable. I don't mind if the door is locked, as long as I can find it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I'll try to be fast, and to the other panelists and to everyone who's there that I can't see. It's really a pleasure to be here and to follow those beautiful words from Gordon Hall. The arrival of minimal art in West Germany was, like much in the transatlantic exchange of the mid to late 1960s, one characterized by latency and fragmentation. There was, strictly speaking, at the time of minimalism's emergence in the US, no real West German equivalent. Artists like Robert Morris and Yvonne Rainer were invited as early as 1963 by Joseph Beuys to perform at the State Art Academy in Düsseldorf and hold informal seminars for students. Thanks in part to Beuys, the discourse around performance was much more developed in Düsseldorf than that of painting or sculpture. After conducting interviews with surviving members of the Beuys class, the class of Joseph Beuys, it was apparent that US formalist criticism was not widely read or discussed at the Academy, nor did Beuys participate in those debates. Though he was nominally appointed as professor for monumental sculpture, Beuys' teaching bore little resemblance to formal training in the language of sculptural practice, at least as far as sculpture per se is concerned. You could say that Beuys' students around the mid-1960s, like Imi Knoebel, but also Blinky Palermo and Katharina Sieverding, were fortunate to be spared the rhetoric surrounding Donald Judd's 1965 text, Specific Objects, which laid out a new form of serious artistic practice that was neither painting nor sculpture, though it relied heavily on the structural concerns of both. Let's see here. Consider Imi Knoebel's Raum 19, Room 19, a collection of wooden stretchers, volumetric shapes, and long lengths of fiberboard, as it first appeared in the studio for which it was named, Room 19. The studio was a teaching annex of Beuys' class in neighboring Room 20, which for a brief period of time from 1966 to 1969 was occupied by Knoebel, Imi Giese, Blinky Palermo, Jörg Immendorf, and Katharina Sieverding. The performance shots taken by Ute Klockhaus, who had documented many of Beuys' performances, are meant to suggest the open nature of the work and the central contradiction that animates Room 19 to this day. While each piece is entirely immutable, the internal organization and displays of the parts of Room 19 is itself mutable. Pieces can be variously stacked, hung on the wall, laid out on the floor, etc. And in the various presentations of Room 19, this capacity remains clear. As a student with no formal artistic training, this was Knoebel's Dictionary of Possible Forms, set out for the future as yet undetermined uses. In other words, Room 19 is not a reduction to some fundamental condition of the sculptural object, just the opposite, really. It is an inventory of early experiments to which the artist continues to return, having subsequently produced 3 more versions of the work. How time is configured is key here, as it is in other works, like the contemporaneous black wooden stacks, which you just heard about in the 250,000 drawings. This is from the current exhibition picture. The experience of time and minimalism, as is well documented in countless revisions of Michael Fried's early critique, from 1967, Art and Objecthood, is one that Room 19 appears to have anticipated without Knoebel ever having read or even mentioned the text. Just briefly, the endless durational solicitation of a viewer's experience in minimalist works like Karl André's Lever, shown here, first exhibited in the landmark show at the Jewish Museum in New York in 1966, Primary Structures, Younger American and British Sculptors, puts this front and center. According to Fried's terms, the 139 bricks arranged in a single line on the floor create an open-ended temporality of the work that is only completed by a viewer's presence. In other words, the work is not wholly present to itself. Compare this with the internal temporality staged by Knoebel's Room 19, where it is known in advance that the work may look different depending on its context. Not the individual parts, mind you, they are fixed, just their organization is subject to change. One single experience of the work, then, is never equal to the work itself, nor does Room 19 depend on a viewer to finish it. Each viewing of Room 19 already performs a temporal distancing between the time in which one experiences the work and the time in which said work exists. This is akin to what the late German philosopher Hans Blumenberg called the separation between lifetime and the time of the world, the groundwork for which was underway at roughly the same time as Primary Structures and Room 19. For Blumenberg, again, someone Knoebel was not aware of, the great madness of civilizations was to try to force one's lifetime to be coextensive with the much greater horizon of the time of the world. Unlike his minimalist colleagues, if we provisionally accept the terms of Fried's arguments, and we certainly don't have to, Knoebel has concretized an ineradicable temporal divide between work and viewer. Room 19 is the instantiation of this separation. Why then work to affect this distance? For Knoebel, the reason was primarily personal, as the work that carried the name of his studio, shared with friends, was unfinished, permanently so. It is a work of memory, unfolding over a time span that is more concrete than the vagaries of experience might otherwise allow. For lack of a more precise term, I would argue that Knoebel's embraced fundamental forms and their performance of time with the desire of making them concrete. And in this way, Knoebel shared this impulse with the US American minimalists, though with very different results. Knoebel, like many of his fellow Room 19 colleagues, saw the first exhibition of the newly opened Conrad Fischer Gallery in Düsseldorf in 1967, featuring Karl André's Altstadt rectangle, a floor piece made of identical square sections of metal. When I asked Knoebel what was potentially stimulating about the work as a student under Beuys, he replied, "The whole work was on the floor." In a different context, this might have sounded a note of democratizing space, taking the sculptural object from its lofty pedestal and bringing it down to the floor. In the case of Knoebel and others, however, the floor had already been christened as a powerful mode of display and interaction, following their teachers' well-known ring discussions, the Ringgespräche, like this one seen here from 1967. This has remained an important element in both US and German minimalism, turning the upright visual address of a work of art back to the pedestrian space of a viewing public. Proof is, of course, of the many reincarnations of the ring discussions, like that performed 2 years ago by Johannes Stuttgen, who you see here on the very left of the black and white photograph in 2019. Like the Urzähne of Beuys's classroom in Room 19, Knoebel has kept the rudimentary formal experiments alive with the addition of color and wall-hanging paintings. This, it must be noted, was occasioned by the death of his close friend and fellow Room 19 inhabitant, Blinky Palermo, beginning in 1977. Since then, Knoebel has remade abstraction in concrete terms, reviving the famous query posed by Barnett Newman in 1969, shortly before his death: who's afraid of red, yellow, and blue? That picture hangs in Berlin, and in 2009, also in Berlin, Knoebel created an exhibition of primary color works under the title, Not Me, Ich nicht, I'm not afraid of red, yellow, and blue. Some earlier examples are on display at DIA in the show there now, continuing the theme of latency I started with, which means both delay as well as unfinishedness. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks to Ian and to Mathilde for this opportunity to think more deeply about the work of Posenenske, which has been actually really surprising and interesting for me to kind of revisit in the context of a book manuscript that I've just completed. So my book, which I'm calling The Traffic in Artists, analyzes a shift in the infrastructure for contemporary art at the end of the 1960s. So at this time, dealers, initially in Germany, began to invite artists, particularly American minimalists and conceptualists, to make their work on site instead of sending objects from their studios. So in place of a network based on the circulation of artworks, which is kind of familiar to us and has been in place in some form since the Dutch 17th century, you could say. The 1970s saw the rise of a new infrastructure based instead on the circulation of artists themselves. The Düsseldorf-based dealer Comrade Fischer, who we've heard about a little bit already today in the other presentations, was among the first to systematize this approach. By flying his artists to Germany and introducing them to other European dealers and collectors, Fischer defined his role in terms of circulating people and bringing them into contact with one another. His job, he said, was, and I'm quoting him here, to bring artists over here and to introduce them to those who live here. In so doing, he established a model that would be applied, I think, globally in the coming decades, and that is only now, I think, for pandemic and technology-related reasons at its end. Artists in the late 1960s and early 1970s tended to respond to these new working conditions in one of three ways. First, and most commonly, I think, by adapting their practices to them. The first exhibition at Fischer's gallery, which was held by Carl Andre in November of 1967, is a particularly clear example of this response. Andre worked in such a way that his presence was required on site. He sourced the metal for the floor piece that you see here from a local fabricator and fitted its format to the unusual tunnel-like architecture of the gallery space. While most artists followed Andre's example, a few did not. Hanne Darboven is a rare example of an artist who worked with Fischer, while at the same time insisting on a stationary and autonomous studio practice. So in December of 1967, she held the second exhibition at Fischer's gallery, which was a two-person show with Posenenske. Darboven made the drawings for this exhibition, one of which you're seeing here, in her apartment studio in New York, where she was living at the time, and mailed them to Fischer in Düsseldorf. In contrast to Andre's floor piece that we just saw, they remain indifferent to conditions on the ground. The third, and perhaps most complex response, is what I would call an allegorical or theatrical one. For artists working in this mode, the infrastructure itself becomes visible as the content of their work. In other words, these artists use their work to model reflexively the same networks of human transportation that dealers like Fischer actually constructed on a logistical level. In the course of preparing this talk, it has occurred to me that it would be interesting to discuss Posenenske's work in terms of this third category. Her contribution, which you see here, to the exhibition with Darboven, consisted of a body of work that she called the Vierkantröhre Serie DW, or DW series tubes. This series comprises building elements, as she described them, fabricated out of cardboard. These modular elements, so a square tube, a rectangular tube, an L-shaped transition piece for changing direction, and a transition piece to connect elements of different sizes, can be arranged into an infinite variety of different configurations. In the case of the Fischer exhibition, as you can see, they form a single large tube that snakes down the entire length of the gallery. Posenenske left the configuration of the elements open to the person installing the work. You can see many more arrangements at the Dia Beacon presentation right now, which I'm showing you here. With its channels, so the tubes, and interfaces, the transition pieces, the DW series is, in the most basic sense, a network. Its building elements, as Posenenske described them, are the building elements of an infrastructure. But an infrastructure for what? The same year that she showed the DW series at Fischer's gallery, Posenenske had her work photographed at a number of different sites related specifically to infrastructure for transporting people. One of these, as you can see here, was the Frankfurt airport. In this photograph, Posenenske installed the D series tubes, which are similar to the DW series at Fischer's gallery, except made of metal instead of cardboard, next to an airplane in the Lufthansa hangar. By juxtaposing her tubes with the aircraft, she implicitly creates a connection between them, as if the plane and the tubes were part of one and the same infrastructure. In a review of the exhibition at Fischer's gallery, one early critic compared Posenenske's sculptures to air ducts. These air ducts, when placed in the airport, acquire the status almost of a visual pun. Like the airplane next to them, they become, so to speak, air infrastructure. Looking at Posenenske's photograph, we can almost imagine a passenger exiting the airplane and entering one of the tubes. The scale of the work, which is almost human size, contributes to this effect. Posenenske originally considered making the tubes even larger, which would have intensified the impression that their purpose was to convey human bodies. She would only realize this ambition in a series of works from 1968 that directly followed the D and DW series, called the Serie E Drehflügel, or E series revolving wings. These works consist of multiple sets of revolving doors, or wings, through which people can enter and exit. Significantly, Posenenske also chose to have the revolving wings photographed at the Frankfurt airport, this time on the tarmac next to the gate. Positioned between the aircraft and the airport, the revolving wings appear as an interface between them, a boarding gate that a passenger would enter through one side and exit through another. I want to end by comparing the infrastructure that Posenenske modeled in her work with the one that Fischer actually constructed. My contention is that they are one and the same. As you can see in the photo on the right, Fischer's gallery, a literal passageway that his artists described often as a tunnel, has the same tubular form as the DW series sculpture that Posenenske installed inside it. The gallery, furthermore, connected to airplanes in precisely the same way that Posenenske had staged in her photographs. The gallery was, so to speak, a tube that artists entered upon arrival at the local airport. Fischer's gallery and Posenenske's tubes are therefore doubles of each other. One models what the other performs, one stages what the other implements. The revolving wings, I think, have a similarly analogous relationship to the operations of invitation and introduction that Fischer put at the center of his work as a dealer. Fischer used air infrastructure to arrange meetings between people. By buying Carl Andre a plane ticket, he was able to meet him in person, as you see here, at a time when most Germans only knew American artists through images of their work. The purpose of the revolving wings, at least in principle, was also to engineer social contact. As interfaces, they are meeting points. One person enters through one side of the sculpture, another through another side, and they meet in the middle. The fact that these meetings take place on a tarmac suggests that the different people arrive on planes from different places. The contact that Fischer encouraged was, of course, specifically international contact. By generating and regulating such contact, the revolving wings theatricalize the same social operations that Fischer put into practice. All the artists who showed with Fischer, I can put it back on that, were critical in different ways and to different extents of the status of art as a luxury commodity. And I think that's been a consistent theme of the talks today. And this is something that that is fairly well known in the traditional narratives of minimalism, conceptualism, and institutional critique. What has remained largely unexamined are the consequences of dealers like Fischer substituting the human body for the commodified artwork. It would be overly simplistic, I think, to say that the result is simply a commodification of the body. Fischer exerted a specific kind of control over the body of his artists that was more subtle, I think, than mere commodification. But the infrastructure that he helped to create did implicate the human body to an unprecedented degree. By analyzing how artists physically responded to this new infrastructure and registered this new form of power, it is possible to understand the work of figures like Posenenske in a new way, and, I think more generally, to grasp some of the key structural features of art in the 1970s. Thanks.
Dear Ian, dear, thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased that I am not the only one who doesn't really talk about German minimalism. My presentation will focus on the more global circulation of mass-produced objects and their visual affinities to certain minimalist artworks, as well as Charlotte Posenenske's conceptual approaches to her sculptural series. In recent years, much of my research has looked into the circulation of certain industrially produced goods, some of which have been designed for military purposes, such as the American-Vietnam War. One of these items that I've been interested in are these M8A1 helicopter landing mats that have been produced for the war in Vietnam, which you can see in this picture here. These helicopter landing mats, which are a further development from the Marston landing mats, were developed throughout the 1950s and in use in the 1960s and 70s to land heavy vehicles such as aircraft and helicopters under wet and muddy conditions on Vietnamese terrain. These mats, with their solid surface, strengthened by corrugations, encouraged the drainage of rainwater to flow more easily, which was important during monsoon seasons in Asia. They were about 22 by 144 inches in size, and they would slot into each other to create a larger surface for landing. Endlessly extendable, they would cover entire fields and allow for multiple aircrafts to land at the same time. From the end of World War II until Vietnam, the US government manufactured 1 million tons of landing mats. The M8A1 mats and previous versions of the mat were developed by the Army Corps of Engineers and exported to Vietnam. Once the war ended in 1975, many of these mats returned to the US, while an equally large amount of them has never left their storage and remained in the States the entire time. Left with so much leftover material, the same Army Corps of Engineers decided to recycle the landing mats and now use them as fencing to build large sections of the US-Mexico border wall. Oops, sorry. Since 1986, the United States has been engaged in the massive public works program, a significant engineering feat in which the fence navigates through rugged, varied terrain from San Diego, California to Brownsville, Texas. The landing mats from the Vietnam era, for instance, have been recycled as border wall in the San Diego sector, as you can see here. An object that was once lying horizontally on the floor was turned vertical to create a barrier. The same material once used for military intervention abroad with the purpose of landing on foreign ground was now repurposed to protect and fence off the edges of one's own territory. Why do I talk about these landing mats? As political scientist Victoria Hatton discusses in her essay Imperial Designs from 2015, there are striking visual affinities between the landing mats and certain minimalist artworks that were developed during the same time period. Where the landing mats were used in Vietnam, the protest of 1986 reflected an escalation of social conflicts, not only in the US and Europe. In reaction to the Tet Offensive, protest also sparked a broad movement in opposition to the war in Vietnam all over the world. The student protest movements have inspired a push towards conceptual art and has equally, to a degree, influenced Charlotte Posenensche's decision to withdraw from the art world, which she announced in the magazine Art International, published in the turbulent month of May 1968, later known as her quote-unquote manifesto. In the same vein, Lucy Lippert argues in her 1973 book, 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972, how the distinct political climate of those years has left significant impact on the emergence and production of conceptual art. All such movements, she claimed, had, quote-unquote, the power of imagination and the desire to escape heroic, patriarchal mythologies at their core. The question here would be whether an idea-based practice which intends on breaking with its formal ties can absorb and challenge the social context in which it is situated in. My argument, following Victoria Hatton's ideas, is that they, to an extent, actually have reproduced the imperial powers they tried to critique. The visual parallels between minimalism and the helicopter landing mats I have explored in an exhibition titled In Cold Print at Nottingham Contemporary in 2020. In these works, I have visually compared the border wall made from the M8A1 landing mats with drawings by Sol LeWitt and Agnes Martin. The Witt's wall drawings especially, which are always site-specifically installed on a wall, build up a composition that in many ways reveal the similarities between border wall and grid, between military designs and abstract lines. I'm just going to quickly scroll through. Another intriguing information that I found during my research was the fact that parts of the chain link fencing of the Japanese internment camps from Crystal City, Virginia, which were established during World War II by Roosevelt, were also repurposed to build very early sections of the US-Mexico border wall. What it reveals is the deep intertwinement of anti-immigration and racism in America and its relationship to colonial histories and how this has carried on to show itself as a border wall now standing between the US and Mexico. So these are the slides from Nottingham Contemporary. What interests me in Posenenske is the fact that she was at the forefront of a group of German artists who used modularity and the geometric language of minimalism to explore the relationship between objects and viewers, or consumers, as she would call them, in the late 1960s. In this slide, we see her square tube Series D, as Michael already mentioned, placed at Frankfurt am Main Airport, a site of transit and travel. To me, the military landing mats reveal parallels to the industrially manufactured sculptures by Posenenske. In her square tube series, I not only see the notion of play, their variability and modularity, as often emphasized by art historians. Instead, I also view her sculptures as barriers, as limitlessly extendable sculptures which anticipate industrialization's infinite strive to multiply. Posenenske's approach forbade the unique relationship between her sculptures and their consumers. To her, the sculptures slowly blend into the space. They become the space itself, and the space transforms into the object, and the distinction between the two become blurry. If you look at the images of the US-Mexico border wall again, one can see how her observations become apparent, how an object, sculpture, border wall, and its surrounding space become one, how the sculpture dictates the behavior and reactions of the people exposed to it. Of course, the border wall is a fixed entity with no movable parts, no variability. Nonetheless, as Posenenske wrote in her statement in Art International, quote, often the elements of their combinations are very large in order to alter the spatial environments more thoroughly. There's another sentence in Posenenske's announcement from May 68 I found especially striking. It says, quote, I make series because I do not want to make individual pieces for individuals. In order to have elements combinable within a system, in order to make something which is repeatable, objective, and because it is economical. I would argue that this type of objectivity is debatable. Are industry-produced goods objective? In many instances, I would argue they are not. What interests me more in Posenenske's work are how they float somewhere in between an artwork and a standardized manufactured object, which captures the language of post-war industrial infrastructures with its connotations of network, system, and flows. Their seriality as reproducible sculptures and their circulation within the white cube and outside in the public space strike me as much as her social and political awareness, which she increasingly integrated into her work, and performative stagings, as well as her perspectives on selling art as an unlimited addition to a fixed price of their production costs. After announcing her withdrawal from the field of art entirely, she went on to study sociology with a focus on industrial labor, with the intention to improve labor conditions for industrial workers, a decision that for me is telling of where she saw the limits of art. Posenenske's thought surrounding mass production, the circulation, infrastructure, and distribution, as well as the limits she saw in the objects as a speculative commodity, and therefore its complicity in a consumer society, have greatly influenced certain parts of my own research. As Catherine Wood points out in her essay, Charlotte Posenenske's Sculpture in the Social Network, quote, Posenenske's objects were prescient in showing us their network state and in implicating us in the same net. The question I would like to end with is, how do not only Posenenske's object, but also the landing mats from Vietnam implicate us? Thank you.
So thank you all for your presentations. This is really fantastic. And actually, I wanted to start with something that came up for me in Gregor's talk. Yeah, German infrastructuralism. I like this as a proposed alternative. I remember when we were first talking about this event, Gregor actually discouraged us from using the term German minimalism at all. So I'm glad we have an alternative proposal now. But that question of thinking about sort of situating this relationship or way of thinking about infrastructure specifically in Germany in the 50s and 60s, I think brought up a question for me that then sort of seemed to come up again and again in every presentation, that seems related to you know, kind of what everyone else is thinking about as well, which is the question of historical specificity, and particularly, you know, I got I had the opportunity to work on the current Posenenske exhibition at Die Beacon. So this is something that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from. But the question of the historical specificity of these projects in the moments where they were created, and whether or not there is actually a possible way to represent that in a gallery space, in a museum space. I think this is related to the question that Hannah brought up of, you know, when is the work? As well as Gordon, to your thinking about sort of vision as belief, right? Where in the encounter with the work is it sort of realized? Does that happen in the viewer? Does it happen in the object? And Colin's discussion of latency in Knoebel's work as well. So I guess maybe actually I'll direct this first to Hannah, as someone who I know thinks a lot about these questions. And in particular in relation to Walther here, but, you know, I would say I think there is this kind of sense of a historical specificity to these projects that at least is a challenge when you try to present these in a museum context, in a gallery context. So yeah, what do we kind of do with that? I mean, is it even possible really to convey these projects accurately when they were created in a very particular social context, political context, and so on?
Such an interesting question. Thank you, Ayn. You know, I could actually answer it in a more straightforward way, but I'm thinking whether it could be interesting perhaps to bring up a really interesting concept, you know, that of intentionality, because it's very particular kind of to my, you know, thinking in the expanded field of conservation, and perhaps also my specialism in thinking about the continuity or afterlife of those works in general. But you know, there is this idea that there is a higher and lower intention in whatever an artist does. No, there is an idea that when an instrument, for instance, was introduced in the past to play a piece of music, it perhaps was, you know, surprising to the audiences. Perhaps it evoked a certain kind of emotion or affects in the audiences that it would not evoke when it would be repeatedly played, you know, over time. So the idea, in a way, is to think about intentionality as higher and lower. That means if we want to kind of adhere to artists' intentions, do we have to, in a way, you know, think about those, reintroduce those pieces as physically the same all the time in order to experience them as such, no, as they were. Oh, it's a little bit echo. As they were once introduced historically. Perhaps, you know, there would be an idea. The idea would be an interesting idea would be to test whether, you know, a new recreation of those works, you know, according to our kind of social-political context, would be possible in these terms, and thinking about them perhaps as homages, or, you know, or works which were inspired by Walther works. I know that it perhaps goes a little bit away from the art historical thinking on those issues, but these are issues that, you know, occupy me. in my perspective. I think that there is, also historical specificity to thinking about replication, for instance, or introducing replicas that is being done now with those works is very kind of specific to our moment. Those works in the past were used as they were, so to say. They were just activated in this particular moment. And nowadays, one thinks through the institutionalization, conservation, and this kind of ethics of care that we are implementing in museums or in institutions, those works are no more activable in these terms, or only activable by certain actors and under strict conditions. So this would be, I think, my answer to it. But I bet there are lots of other thoughts on this.
Thanks. Yeah, I maybe want to kind of throw that actually back to Gregor and maybe Colin as well, because I think I'm thinking in particular about Posenenske again. I mean, my own dissertation's on Posenenske. That's kind of my most, familiar, thought about the most. But I do think in present day and recent exhibitions of their work, you tend to see this kind of talking about it as if there's this kind of like kumbaya, like everybody participates, it's democratic kind of, idea of what that version of participation was about. And I suspect, I think in the late 60s in Germany, in that political context, right, it had a different kind of edge to it. Something that perhaps, it is lost when you simply restage the work in a new context, right? I don't know. So maybe Gregor, do you want to respond? We're getting a little echo here. Okay, there we go. Yeah, Gregor, can I throw that back at you?
Okay, I'll pause. So there's no echo. Okay. Yeah. All right. I do think about this particular question a lot. In part because one of my one of the things I'm trying to correct in writing about Walther is that I do think he quite specifically forms his ideas in the 1950s, and that they are best read. That a lot of these ideas, as they evolve, are best read with that background, because they sort of they come out of a certain, I think, and this is my contention, I think they come out of a certain anxiety around large scale and small scale social interaction and societal processes of societal formation that are especially intense in the 50s. But that is balanced out, I think, by the very structure of many of the works, which are very much based on perpetual incompletion and perpetual incompletion. The works can be activated, or if you want, I like to say completed temporarily for a couple of minutes at a time, but then they enter back into a stage of incompletion. And this is also the work set, which is now on view at DIA, is a great example of that, because throughout the decades of its existence, it has actually changed. It's changed its appearances in this, and those changes have been very much bound up with a certain sense of that Walther had of being before his own time, sort of. Like the whole idea of the storage form, which is similar to what's now on view at DIA, came out of a frustration with how people were activating the work, that they were not taking it seriously enough, they weren't really understanding it. Then the work went back into storage, and then only into storage form, and was for a while only exhibited in that way. And then later, under the influence of the Franz Erhard Walther Foundation, then sort of came back to life. And I think that sort of nervousness about things being activated correctly, I think is best explained out of the original moment of sort of formation, but can't be read from today without sort of knowing that this is a work that has changed over decades. And I think there's several things that sort of come out of that for me. The first thing is, and I think I would like to ask you, Ian, and Michael actually about this, because I think one of the things that I haven't gotten to in the dissertation yet, but I will eventually have to get to, is the role that with artists like Posenenske and Walther, and perhaps also Knoebel, I don't know, the role that foundations or estates play and institutions in sort of making the work, continuing the work, keeping it alive. And I think in Walther's case, that has been like the whole idea of rediscovery, that wouldn't be conceivable without the work of the Franz Erhard Walther Foundation under Susanne Walther. But and I think with Posenenske, that's sort of, you know, I mean, I read your dissertation, Ian, so the first footnote about the sort of the estate is important. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, can we stage it, restage it? Does it matter today, and so forth? The reason why you would want to invent an ism, I called it flippantly Infrastructuralism, is because I think that concern, maybe in different forms, continues on. If you look at, you know, I think Sung's work, which I happen to know a little bit about, there are infrastructures and bureaucracies that work, that Sung's work plays with and works with and critiques and works through. It's a very different kind of bureaucracy. It's a very different kind of infrastructure. And yet I you know, from where I'm sitting, the connections can be drawn and can be brought to life, I think.
Yeah, I would actually love to hear, Gordon, your response to this question as an artist, and as an artist who, you know, creates objects and sculptures that are performed with. You know, how do you think about sort of your intention as an artist versus the viewer's experience? And do you think about the question of the longevity of the work into the future as well?
Hello. How about now? Okay. Well, I suppose I want to answer this in two ways. I mean, one is, I think, as my presentation makes very clear, although I've never cared, you know, been particularly concerned with the sort of disciplinary distinctions between art historians and artists and critics, I think in regard to this particular question, being an artist has allowed me to give myself a permission to find things in works that I think it's quite possible that the artists who made them would not have foreseen or perhaps might not agree with. And that's something that I think all artists do, you know, like we're looking for nourishment from artwork, and we're very, you know, our thought really comes from loving things. I'm glad art historians have the job of trying to figure out what is the most the way of presenting the work that's the most true to the artist's intentions. And I hope that, you know, if there's some future time when I no longer exist and a curator is trying to figure out how I would want the work presented, that they would have really done that job. But on the other hand, I also think that, you know, artworks are living, and they, like I say, even if they're presented in exactly the same way, they will always be different because the context will be different and the viewer will be different. And that's just, for me, it's one of the exciting things about making work, that you put it out in the world and then it does all kinds of things. It almost has a form of agency that goes way beyond what I would have thought for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think also to the question that Gregor raised about the role of the estate, I think that's obviously really important, and particularly with Posenenske, it's a big part of the picture, because as Sung mentioned, Posenenske quit being an artist in '68, and it's only in the '80s after she died, right, that her husband starts showing the work again and establishes the estate. So that's a big part of the story of her work. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Can everyone hear this? Is this mic'd? Okay, great. So we have a question from the Zoom participants. Daniel Spalding asks, contrary to Ian's question might be exactly whether latency renders the work anachronic in the Chris Wood, Alex Nagel sense. This seems very much the case of round 19, as Colin points out. So the question then becomes whether anachrony is historically specific, and moreover, why this would emerge in Germany in the 1960s.
Does anybody want to tackle that?
I mean, I think I'm sort of on the hot seat here about that.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
No? Yeah.
If I can add to that, we're having this conversation, of course, in the United States. We're talking about context, intentionality, and meaning. There is also something to be said about US hegemony in all this and the opacity of certain German everyday context that may be totally missing here, but is not necessarily due to anything else than US hegemony. Thank you.
Well, perhaps, Michael, you'd like to connect this point to the question of the circulation of artists.
Okay, so I could I think Daniel's question is right on point, and he's also right that there may not be a way to answer this, sufficiently without getting into Vergangenheitsbewertung and Nachträglichkeit. But even without those terms, there is a sense, I think, that that I think the anachrony that Daniel is describing at this time is related to a certain anxiety around make sort of definitive structures and definitive social formations, which is understandable in the moment, given that mass social organization had just quite recently led to catastrophe and genocide, and so there is a broad movement, I think, of sort of sociology and sort of general social thinkers in Germany in the 50s that are all about sort of anxiety about how one can sort of stage social interaction, and one of the features of that is a certain anxiety around permanence and scale of social structures, which is why I've been reading a lot of very obscure sociology about sort of university sociologists writing about rioting youths. Why are youths rioting? And there's like several books about one rock and roll concert where riots happened after. And there's a lot of anxiety around how can one form a society even. And so that has a lot to do with I think the recent experience and sort of a certain opposition to one's parents' generation. Yeah.
Can I jump in there for a second? I mean, just in the case of Knoebel, what's helpful, or what was helpful for me, is to think very small. I think the tendency or the desire to kind of immediately have things echo a kind of larger social structure. I mean, he once explained that the size of the pieces of Raum 19 could only be so big that they would fit in the tram that went from his apartment to the, to the art academy. Or that the idea of remembering the room was something that was very personal. But I think the question of latency is, in that sense, is paradoxically very historically specific. I think there's a wonderful book by Anselm Haverkamp, a sort of German literary theorist, called Latenzzeit, which really describes exactly a different path, one that's not in the intellectual history of the 60s, is not aware to everyone is aware of, let's say, aside from Frankfurt School, Habermas, Gadamer, the kind of usual signposts.
That idea of latencycy latency or kind of the temporal indeterminacy being historically specific, I think is super interesting, and I think kind of gets to maybe part of the core of sort of identifying what it is about this period, this geography that has this kind of specificity. It also reminds me though of what Sung was saying, that kind of Sung's maybe like provocation that or questioning the supposed neutrality or objectivity of minimalist form, which I think is a really fantastic point. With Posenenske, there was an intention at some point to create those sculptures as kind of an architecture, so at an architectural scale. So the size was partly determined, the actual formal aspects of the sculptures was determined by the requirements of being able to produce them cheaply, or cheaply enough. So there are these kind of other external factors that come into play. But I think if I can come back to Michael for a second, I think what I was going to ask is about, you're describing this new situation where artists rather than artworks are kind of circulating between different contexts across the ocean, and so on. So for you, thinking, I guess, as a historian, right? Is there a way in a context like, say, a beacon to sort of reflect these kinds of social exchanges, social networks? I know this is kind of a big, big question, but because so much of what we do here is focused on objects, right? And I guess this is more, it's kind of a question about the distinction between the disciplines of curating and art history, maybe, but I don't know. I'm just curious to hear more.
That's a great question. Is it working now? Yeah, great. No, I think it speaks to this other issue about institutions that was brought up earlier as well, and what kinds of institutions this new kind of work and these new kinds of artists are most at home in, and what can actually support these new kinds of practices and these new conceptions of what an artwork is. And in Germany and in Europe more broadly, of course, there is a kind of shift that happens around the same time, with curators actually, as well as dealers. So there are a number of curators working in the Rhine region and in Belgium and elsewhere in Europe, who were basically doing the same thing that Fischer's doing. So inviting people over, hosting them, which is also an important aspect of all of this that I didn't really talk about so much today. So the distinction between the dealer and the curator, sort of begins to erode a little bit, also because dealers aren't really thinking about their role purely in transactional terms either, which is something that I hope was sort of implicit in my talk. But it's not just about trading objects for money. It's about this other kind of more broadly defined social function that Fischer is performing. And interestingly, now that this conversation is happening at DIA, I think there's a there's an interesting connection here to, to the foundation of DIA itself as an institution by Heinrich Friedrich and Philippa Dumesnil. In 1974, I mean, there's a kind of interesting way in which, what DIA is doing with artists here in New York is a little bit like what someone like Fischer was doing in Germany, albeit on a much larger scale. So in terms of, providing artists with spaces to live, in some cases, to house their work on a kind of permanent basis, thinking about, exhibition sites as almost like pilgrimage sites in a certain way, which is, one way to kind of understand this kind of circulation, in Europe that I'm talking about. So yeah, I think basically new artistic practices, new approaches to art objects require new kinds of institutions, and those institutions did emerge at that time.
Are we okay? Well, maybe are there any other? Okay, there's yeah, Donna. Should I bring you the microphone? Yeah. So that they can hear you.
Take this off for now. Okay, thank you. Well, one is a point and the other is a question, I suppose. To the point about, DIA itself, I was just thinking so much about DIA, of course, as an artist-driven organization. And, the reality of the kind of historical specificity that you're all talking about, and I think is essential. I don't think it's recoverable in the presentation per se. It's recoverable, if you want to call it that, in the contextual information that's provided, which at times is at odds with the desires of the artists and their presentation. So, this is the inevitable friction, I think, that exists within institutional contexts and will play out differently. I mean, previously to DIA, many of you know I was at the Whitney for many years, and we use text panels and things like that. And DIA has a very different approach, although we do, other brochures and materials that can present that information. In fact, Ian's written a number of these amazing brochures and essays that accompany the work. So I think there is a place for that. I look, Gordon, at you, and you understand from an artist perspective, the desire to have the work presented as you wish it to be. And this is the artist's intent, I think, which is in the case, by the way, of artists who are deceased, especially without a foundation. All we have to go on, in fact, is the intent that we're aware of. But my question has to do, Michael, I've talked very much about systems over the years. And I was just curious if, in the US, of course, the rise of systems theory, which was so fundamental in terms of the military industrial complex and Kennedy, and of course, during the Vietnam War, it got McNamara and a lot of other people in trouble. Do you see a parallel that existed within Germany at the time, from the 50s into the 60s, of another theorization that would run concurrent with those two? I must admit I'm more knowledgeable in the US context than in the German, so I defer to you experts. Thank you.
Well, I think Gregor might be able to speak to this issue just as well, if not better than I can. But certainly, the discourses of cybernetics and what we would now call systems theory were very prominent in Germany beginning in the 1950s. And there are different phases of artistic perception of those ideas, beginning with concrete poetry and things like that in the 1950s, and continuing probably, I would imagine, in Walther's work. Although I don't want to speak for Gregor here, obviously, but I would think that Walther's probably reading or at least aware of things like that, probably more so than someone like Fischer, who's kind of a practical sort of person. I mean, he's not influenced by any theory necessarily. And I don't think Posenenske, I mean, she read sociology and things like that, but systems theoretical sociology, I don't know. I feel like maybe not, but I could be wrong there. Do you know?
No.
Okay. Sounds like a no. Yeah. Okay.
More rooted in sociology.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Donna, for the question. There, as Michael very correctly says, there is a lively discussion of sort of cybernetics in Germany, especially in Ulm, however. So this is sort of the Max Benze set that is very enthusiastically, and one might say uncritically at times, consuming and promoting cybernetic thinking. And I just sent a thing in the chat, which is a cover for one of Walther's books. I can also share my screen or something. But basically, Walther, as he sort of has, despite my continual prodding, has insisted, did not read cybernetics theory, systems theory, or any such thing. He very much read poetry, but surprisingly expressionist poetry over concrete poetry. But there are definitely moments where he, in some way, does adopt some of the sort of rhetoric or some of the visual tools of cybernetic thinking. And on one of his first demonstrations, work demonstrations, you're not allowed to call them performances, work demonstrations in Düsseldorf, he sort of gives out a handout with a diagram that looks very much like a Shannon-esque communications diagram. And that is basically, it says work on one end, then it says instrument, vehicle, and producer, and they're a triangle, and then there are two other arrows leading to another point, another node that says Künstler or artist, and that one is crossed out. So he's in some way using and intervening into communications theoretical rhetoric without particularly diving all that deeply into the weeds, which I think, is just as interesting as if he, probably more interesting than if he went the Ulm route for my personal standpoint.
But you also have Luhmann and Bielefeld. I mean, that's like, you have sociology, systems theory. This is like, that's also very, and also writing about the kind of social structures of art.
Just one tiny point to Donna's question. I think the issue of systems here also in a way relates to this theme of agency that we've been, or intentionality that we've been talking about, throughout the conversation. I mean, I think, when I talk about this kind of reflexivity that you see, where the work in a way duplicates the infrastructure or the communication network that facilitates it, that effect is a systemic effect, I would say, and it's something that occurs through a kind of systemic agency and not necessarily through the agency. I lost myself. Not through the agency of the artist necessarily making the work. And I think the artists have different degrees of awareness to the extent that they are making these things reflexively visible in their work, but they don't necessarily have to sit down and say, I'm going to do that. The system in which they are operating, makes that decision for them in a way, which is, I think, why you find effects like this so commonly across a whole range of differently categorized or categorizable practices. I mean, you see it in Posenenske, you see it in someone like Paul Tech, who I'm also interested in. You see it in, really a very, very wide range of artists that had nothing to do with one another and who you would never put in the same room together. So, yeah.
I want to make sure, are there other questions in the chat that we should address? I know we're
I mean, there are two other questions, but we are also almost 20 minutes over. So
okay, goodness. Well, then we probably have to wrap up here, I think. But yeah, thank you all so much for participating in this. This has been fantastic. Nice to see you all, even if only on a screen, but hopefully, in person someday soon. And thank you guys for being here as well. Thanks everybody for coming. And yeah, thanks for sticking it out. Yeah, great. Okay.